Thank you very much, Ujwal. I just have to say before I start, what a pleasure it is and an honor to be here, and how impressive the efforts of Melbourne Business School and Ujwal in particular have been in putting together this program, the conference, and the Masters in Data Analytics. When Ujwal asked me to present here and kind of try to find that balance between bringing slightly academic, geeky-oriented work into industry and how I might be able to share those with you, then we focused on this topic that I've been very passionate about, because for many, many years, and all the way going back almost 20 years to my dissertation, I was very interested in reputation and trust and what kind of oils that machinery of transactions between parties. So let me start with what I say the beginning. I know in Australia, eBay has been quite popular. Just out of curiosity, how many people here ever bought something on eBay? Okay, quite a lot. How many people here bought stuff on Amazon? Okay. In 15 years, because you're probably about 15 years behind the US in this, nobody will raise their hand when I ask about eBay, and everybody will raise their hand when I ask about Amazon. And over beers, we could talk about why. So this is going to be familiar to many of you. This is what's called a item detailed page on eBay after you search, for example, for a MacBook. And here's the item that comes up. It's a 13.3, it's a 13.3-inch MacBook Pro, you see that it has a bunch of information. It has the price. You could buy it now. You could pay with PayPal and so on. And then up here in the right corner is some information about the seller. So let me blow that up. And here's what this says. The seller's name is Electronics Valley. Then there's a number next to that, which is 21,814. That's what eBay calls the reputation score. And that is calculated as the number of positive reputations or positive feedback that seller got minus the number of negatives. And that's a big number. So you kind of look at that and you say, oh, wow, that looks kind of reassuring. And then there's another number, 99.2%. And that 99.2% means that of all the feedback that this seller got, 99.2% were positive. Now, when I see a number like 99.2%, that looks really, really impressive, because, you know, I know that there are many accomplished people in this room, and you know, I did kind of okay myself. I never had a GPA of 99.2, right? You know, reaching those kind of numbers is quite phenomenal. So how good is 99.2? This is the actual distribution of positive feedback on eBay. This graph is a few years old, but not that old. I first want to make the following observation. So that this even looks like a graph, I started it at 98%. Okay? Because if I would start at 0, it would be a little bit of a problem. The median is 100%. More than half the sellers on eBay have 100% positive. 99.2 is in fact below the average. Okay? The average is 99.3. And 97.8 is the 10th percentile. Now, there are two ways to rationalize and tell a story about what's going on here. One is the good story, okay? This is actually Shangri-La. eBay works perfectly. Anyone who slips up a couple of times, people stop buying from them, they disappear, and only the best and the brightest are left. I don't know for how many people the Lake Wobegon effect means anything, but there's a popular public radio program in the US where there's a town, Lake Wobegon, that used to be where everybody's above average and so on and so forth. So that's story number one. Sellers with bad reputation are kicked off and they no longer operate. Of course, story number two might be that feedback is heavily biased. As most good academics, you usually look for the truth in comic books, and this is a little comic strip where it pretty much describes the world of online feedback quite well. If something has 5 stars, it probably only has 1 review. 4.5 stars is excellent, 4 is okay, and everything else is crap. So that pretty much turns out to be universal, and there's a lot of studies now, data from other websites, Airbnb and so on, where you actually see this kind of phenomena where you have this great inflation and these very high feedback scores that leaves the signal somewhat, buried in the noise. So the question is, how could online marketplaces like eBay and many others solve some of these problems that have to do with creating trust and creating a system where buyers could feel comfortable and safe purchasing goods from sellers on that site? And I'm making this very clear as a marketplace, and I want to distinguish that from a retailer. So taking Amazon as an example, until the early 2000s, Amazon was just a retailer. When you went to Amazon, you bought stuff sold by Amazon. And then at some point, they opened up a marketplace, and they let other people sell on that site. So I want to distinguish between those, because as a retailer, then you have your brand, and that's the brand and the image that you're promoting, and then you kind of create this relationship between yourself and customers. When you're a marketplace, you really have to manage this large, anonymous, multiplayer platform where people are connecting on both sides, and how do you manage trust in that kind of environment? So some of the problems that this gives rise to, and that I'm going to try to talk about several of them and give some insights, are what I call the great inflation problem that I just described. So we'll talk about that. The public good problem. People don't leave feedback all the time. How do you get people to leave informative feedback? And the cold start problem. What happens once you have an established marketplace? It could be that Ujwal is a seller that already has his 5,000 score and a 99 point something, and now I'm a new seller and I don't have anything. Who's going to buy from me? Right? Will people give me that initial trust? How could we jumpstart a new seller who might actually be as good or better than the very best sellers on the marketplace? So I'm going to talk about how marketplaces are going to solve these challenges. And I first want to quote an economist that I'm a big fan of, and I feel proud that I could call him a friend. His name is Al Roth. He got the Nobel Prize in economics a few years ago for fundamental work on markets. Well, I won't call them markets, but kidney exchange platforms, so to speak. And he wrote a paper almost 15 years ago that was published 16 years ago, where he said that market designers, which is kind of a fancy name for economists who try to understand and build insights into the way that markets work, cannot work only with simple conceptual models used for theoretical insights. Instead, market design calls for an engineering approach. And the reason I want to say this is that a lot of economists in academia are really concerned with these very stylized models that are interesting and gain insight, but then translating them to actionable industry is somewhat challenging. And really, to get an impact, you need to kind of cut corners sometimes. But what I really want to bring forth and argue is important is the idea that using an economic framework, an economic theory of how to get things to work does require an understanding of the fundamental economics. And I loved a slide that John Wiley put up earlier. I don't know if John's still here, but he put up a slide where he says, it was data isn't information, information isn't knowledge, and knowledge isn't wisdom. And I really think that that's fundamental, because there are so many people who think data equals wisdom, okay? Data equals garbage if you don't know what to do with it. And to know what to do with it requires some model of the world, some critical thinking about what the moving parts are. And this is where I think economics has a lot to bring to the table. Now, obviously, as an economist, I'm biased, and I think economics can explain everything. Otherwise, I wouldn't be a card-carrying economist. But with all seriousness, there are very important and interesting insights from economics about human interaction and human behavior that help us understand the data-generating process. And for all of you in the crowd who are really interested in business analytics and data science, I really would like you to remember those three words, the data-generating process, because that's the story that makes the data look the way it does. And if you don't have a story to take with you when you're approaching the analytics, then all you're doing is churning water. You need to be able to think about hypotheses. I love machine learning. It's extremely valuable. But we have to remember that when a machine learner comes and tells you, I'm going to tell you what you need to do based on the data, they come from a world where they believe that there is a constant data generating process. You throw machine learning at it, and you uncover what that data generating process is. Now, in a world of physics, that makes a lot of sense. As economists, we understand that the world we deal with is more complicated than physics. Do you know why? Because our atoms think, okay? And because they think, when you change something, people change their behavior. And if people change their behavior, they change the data generating process. Okay, and that's the key thing that I want you to remember, because you're going to see how this plays some roles in what I'm going to talk about. So here's idea number one of something we did at eBay. So we realized, okay, this data is very skewed in terms of the positive feedback score. Why is that the case? Well, a lot of people that may have negative experiences may not want to leave negative feedback. For example, someone in the UK once bought a clock. This was in I think, The Guardian many years ago. Didn't work. They left the seller a negative feedback. The seller sued the buyer for defamation. Now, even if that is a completely vacuous lawsuit, that person needed to deal with it. And I'm sure they regretted leaving the negative feedback. And anyone who read that article is not going to leave negative feedback, because why take the risk? When I leave negative feedback, who am I doing a favor? I'm doing a favor for you who haven't come to the site yet, right? And if I'm an economist, I'm selfish. And if I'm selfish, I don't give a shit about you. So I don't leave feedback, right? So, that might be one reason. And there could be just the laziness that people don't want to deal with it. So we then realized, you know what, that really means that the story we have to tell ourselves is that there are two kinds of people who don't leave feedback. There are people like me who are selfish economists and they don't leave feedback, regardless of if they had a good or bad experience. But then there are other people who really want to leave feedback, but they know that if they leave negative feedback, the seller might harass them. So they won't leave negative feedback and they'll only leave positive feedback. But that means that silence has a combination of lazy people and unhappy people, which means that on average, silence is more unhappy than average. Okay, well, what can we do with that? Let's create a new measure that we're going to call effective percent positive, where we're going to take the number of positive feedback and not divide it by the number of total feedback, but by the number of total transactions. What does that mean? Just to use this as an example, imagine two sellers, seller A and B. They both have 99 positive, they both have 1 negative. Using eBay's measure, they will both have exactly 99% positive. But now let's imagine that seller A had 20 people who didn't leave feedback, and seller B had 50 people that didn't leave feedback. Our hypothesis is seller B is a worse seller. And in fact, when we calculate the number of positive divided by total transactions, seller A is going to have an effective percent positive of 82.5, and seller B 66%. So first, if we're claiming that there's information in this, let's see if it looks like something informative. Remember that hockey stick of percent positive, there was no information there. This is what effective percent positive looks like. Suddenly it looks like something with information in it. It has a mean of about 64% and quite a nice standard deviation of about 14%. The second thing that we did, and I'm not going to go into the details, but this is where we used a regression model, logistic regression for those who are familiar, which is kind of at the core of almost all machine learning type of algorithms. We look to see whether this score will predict the future behavior of customers on eBay. Namely, imagine two customers. One goes to a seller that has a high effective percent positive, and one goes to a seller that has a low effective percent positive. The good news is that they don't know whether a seller has a high or low effective percent positive, because eBay doesn't publish that. So now we have what we call a nice experimental setup where people can self-select into who they're buying from. And then what we saw is that the better the effective percent positive of the seller you bought from, the more likely you are to come back to eBay. Now, that's as strong evidence as you could need in order to show that this really has an impact on consumer behavior. Well, what could we do then? Well, here's what we could do with that. If you think of a search results page, when you go to eBay and you search for MacBook Air, you're getting a bunch of listings. eBay has an algorithm that Hugh Williams, who was here earlier, was in charge of a team of many hundreds of engineers and scientists who build that algorithm so that you're going to see things that are somewhat supposed to be relevant for what you're looking for. There are many things you could throw into the secret sauce of that algorithm, including information about the quality of the seller. So what if we take this algorithm and we now use the effective percent positive to promote sellers who have a higher score and demote sellers who have a lower score? This is a way in which the platform could be paternalistic, using these insights to determine the quality of the sellers that you're going to see. And of course, what you should all know, and India here also did a bunch of work on search a while back. When you're on page number 4, you're dead. You know, the likelihood that anyone reaches you. So if someone doesn't have a great EPP and you put them on page 3 or 4, it's as if you threw them off the website. Okay? And what we showed is that when they did this, it actually improved the repurchase rate, the comeback rate of buyers on eBay, suggesting that this really did improve buyer experience. So this is one example. What else is in the data? Well, we played around with the data and we found something that looked kind of bizarre. So remember I told you that most of the feedback is positive. Indeed, negative feedback is only 0.4% roughly, 0.39%. Disputes filed, more than 1%. People are more likely to file a dispute than just to leave negative feedback. But then we saw something very interesting in messages on the platform. So eBay lets buyers and sellers send messages to each other. This is something that the site had for many, many years. The reason behind it was, you know, especially when you're selling used shit, then I may need to ask you a question. Oh, it looks like it has a scratch. Does it really have a scratch? And you answer, yes, it has a scratch, but it's really this long, and so on and so forth. And of course, as economists, we think, why should anyone send emails after the transaction? Doesn't make sense, unless there might be a problem. And now we could use, Steve Eglash in the morning talked about natural language processing. We could use a bag of words approach or some other way to look for sentiment in those emails. And the conjecture would be, if I'm sending you a message after the transaction that has a bad sentiment, it probably means that I'm not happy. Why shouldn't we use that information? Well, here's an example, and this is again based off of some research we did with the eBay data. Here is what we would call a non-negative message. Of course, no economist can understand why anyone would send a non-negative message, because that's just a waste of your time. But some people are actually kind of nice, it turns out. Yeah, economists really have trouble understanding a lot of things in the world. Hello, good morning. I'm glad to tell you the 2 items arrived. I'm happy because I needed it for a dinner party. Thanks a lot, kind regards. Okay. Here's a message where we are detecting negativity. For example, I purchased 2 pairs of shorts, blah, 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 which I haven't received in the second parenthesis. Clearly, unhappy buyer. So what can we do now? We take the data. We have other indications of when buyers are happy or unhappy in the data. And here's what we found out. What you see over here in this spline plot is the first chunk are purchases that had no emails with them. Then we have a chunk over here. They had an email, but we couldn't, in our sentiment analysis, detect any negativity. And finally is the group of purchases where we could detect negativity. Now, let's look at all the other indicators we have for this not being a great experience. And it turns out that for the ones without a message, only about 4% of transactions, that's the blue sliver on top, had another indicator that the buyer was unhappy. Once a message was sent, even if we can't detect anything negative, it jumps up to about 13%. And when the algorithm detects a negative sentiment, it jumps up to 33%. Now there's information that is not being used that could be used. And in particular, we could create an index, just like we did with EPP, of you're a seller. Okay, so for example, Jeffrey here is a seller. And Jeffrey, for every 100 transactions, generates 1 negative email. And Ashish here, for every 100 transactions, generates 4 negative emails. Who's the better seller? Jeffrey's the better seller, because he generates a lower percentage of negative emails. Why not use that against the sellers? Another way we could dig into the data, think about the data generating process, and move on. And now I want to talk and conclude with the last example. And this is actually based off of research that I did with a couple of co-authors using data from Taobao. And I'm very excited about the possibility of gaining access to more data from Alibaba. I've recently been asked to join as a academic advisory board member of a new initiative that Alibaba launched called the Luohan Academy, where they really want to engage social scientists in order to leverage the Alibaba data and learn things about the broader economy and many things that you could imagine would be really interesting. What's very exciting about Alibaba is that Alibaba is eBay and Amazon and PayPal. I mean, it's all under one roof, so you take that data, you cross-match it, and, you know, depending on your intentions, it could either be amazing or it could be pretty dangerous. But, you know, my intentions are pure, I promise you that. So how could buyers be induced to provide more honest feedback, and how could good sellers build a reputation when they don't have one? Thanks, Ujwal. So let me jump quickly to a story to tell you where we thought about this setting. So there's a paper that dates back now over 40 years, close to 50 years, a very clever idea applied to advertising by Philip Nelson, an economist back then who was quite prolific. And he made the following observation. You know what? Advertising could actually be considered a signal of quality. Why is that? Imagine that there are two kinds of sellers in the world. Sellers with good products and sellers with shitty products. Now imagine that a seller comes up and they could only make money if you buy from them several times in a row. Okay, if you only bought one item, they're not going to cover their advertising costs. So a seller comes now and takes a $100 bill and just says, hey, look at me, I'm taking a $100 bill and I'm burning it. And I'm going to make the following speech, so to speak. If I were a crappy seller, I shouldn't burn this money. Because you're going to come, you're going to try my product, you're not going to like it, you're never going to buy it again, and I just burned $100. But if I'm a good seller, I want to burn this $100 to grab your attention, because then you'll buy from me, you're going to be happy, and then you're going to buy again and again, and then I'll cover the $100. So advertising is purely a signal of, I have good products, because if I didn't have good products, I wouldn't advertise. So we took this idea and said, well, we could apply this to a mechanism that Taobao launched a few years ago, where they let sellers say, I'm going to pay people for leaving feedback for me, just for the act of leaving feedback, but the payment is not going to be conditional on whether or not the feedback is positive or negative. The payment is going to be conditional on whether the feedback is informative. Now, how would a seller determine if it's informative? Of course, a seller is biased. They want the feedback to be positive. But here's where Taobao comes in and says, no, this is how it's going to work. The seller will give us a pot of money, kind of like an escrow. We're going to look and use a natural language processing algorithm at the feedback. And if we determine that it's relevant based on the text and what people leave, then we're going to give that buyer a payment. And if it looks like, you know, oh, this was a quick and dirty, oh, yeah, I love the product, A++++. No, you don't get payments for that. So the testable implications of this story is that if a marketplace lets sellers pay for feedback mediated through the marketplace, then that will help good sellers distinguish themselves from bad sellers and then flourish on the marketplace. So I'm going to jump ahead. This is kind of what it looks like. It's all Chinese to me. And here's what we saw. So this is the number of characters from 0 all the way to above 30, where what you see in black is for items that did not have this payment for feedback, and in gray is items that had payment for feedback. And basically it shifts things from the bottom, less informative, to the top, more informative. This 18 is an artifact for the fact that Taobao has these automatic feedbacks. If you didn't leave any words, it just has 18 Chinese characters that says this is automatic. So at least people respond to incentives. But importantly, what we find is that sales with that rebate jumped up dramatically. It turns out that people seem to understand that if you're paying for feedback, you probably are going to have a good product, because it would be stupid for you to pay for feedback if you're going to screw me over and then I'm going to leave you negative feedback. And then we also found that, of course, the number of ratings went up. And, I'm not going to go into the fine details. Interestingly, what didn't happen is that ratings were not more positive. So in fact, it's a little hard to see here, but at the margin, they were even slightly less positive because people are more likely to get disappointed thinking this is going to be awesome, but then it's okay, but it might not be that awesome. So to summarize what we've talked about here, marketplaces have many interesting tools based on an understanding of what's going on in the data and how do I think about the economics of interaction, of beliefs over the quality of goods, and of trust. And in particular, the economist as this kind of social engineer could solve this, what I'll call a missing market, because we don't know who's good and who's not good until we buy from them. What signals could be generated in order to offer that level of trust? And I want to conclude with one last thing, that it is important that this secret sauce that the companies use, the marketplaces use, is indeed a secret sauce. Because, for example, if I start telling sellers I'm going to use silence against them, what's going to happen when they have a transaction and someone didn't leave them feedback? You're going to start getting emails, leave me feedback, leave me feedback, leave me feedback, because no feedback is bad feedback. So just like Google, when they rank ads and they have these quality scores that people who buy the ads don't understand how they are, it's important for marketplaces to have these models where they know what's going on, but they don't necessarily let others know what's going on. In other words, transparency may not always be the right outcome. And I'll conclude with that.
That's terrific. Steve, thank you very much for that talk.